And I give the call now to the honourable member for Kooyong.
Mr Deputy Speaker, you know you have a problem in foreign policy when one of your nearest neighbours hosts a significant regional leaders meeting and you are not invited, but Luxembourg is.
Expect to be invited.
Hang on, might you say. Isn't Luxembourg the second smallest member of the European Union, a relatively minor aid donor and insignificant in the global security debate? Yes, it is. But it is also a candidate for a temporary seat on the UN Security Council for 2013-14. You guessed it, in a runoff against Australia. So there we have it, the European Luxembourg being personally invited by Fiji's Prime Minister Frank Bainimarama to join him and the leaders of Papua New Guinea, the Solomons, Vanuatu, New Caledonia and representatives of Indonesia and East Timor at the Melanesia Spearhead Group Summit he recently hosted in Suva. Luxembourg in, Australia out. A diplomatic humiliation, if ever there was one. And to boot, a significant setback for our Security Council candidacy, which to be successful would require widespread support from our neighbours in the region. But what is more disconcerting for the future of Australian policy is that this event is symptomatic of a broader malaise in our Pacific strategy. In the words of the respected government-funded Australian Strategic Policy Institute, ASPI, in their 2011 strategic assessment titled Changing Pace, Australia's, quote, influence in the South Pacific is in relative decline. The report goes on to suggest that our absence from regional groupings such as Bainimarama's group, the heightened interventions of third countries in the region, and the rise of a new generation of leadership who do not have the deep and abiding personal relationships with Australia that their predecessors had, are all contributing factors to our decline. Such a development is a code red for Australian diplomacy. The South Pacific is our backyard and has to be tended to as such. In fact, stability and security in the South Pacific was highlighted in the 2009 Defence White Paper as the second priority task for the ADF, after ensuring Australia from direct attack. The Department of Foreign Affairs, in their strategic documents, also place an equivalent weight on our interests in the South Pacific. But just as it guides the Gillard government's official policy as prepared by the bureaucrats, it's also the direction and priority laid out by the Labor Party's political apparatchiks at the last election. In the Labor Party's 2010 election document, Advancing Australia's Interests Internationally, it boasts on page 10, and I quote, "Federal Labor has reversed the years of neglect of the Pacific by the Coalition. We have restored strong relationships with countries like Papua New Guinea and Solomon Islands. Federal Labor has taken forward a comprehensive agenda with our Pacific Island neighbours. Our efforts have been welcomed by the region and have ensured that difficult issues like the political situation in Fiji have been met by the region with a unified stance." Well, that's news to the region, Mr Deputy Speaker, and another culpable example of Labor spin. Pacific leaders turned up in their droves to accept Bainimarama's invitation, despite Australia and New Zealand's absence. After succeeding last year to persuade Vanuatu's former Prime Minister, Edward Natapai, to cancel the summit and prevent a handover to Bainimarama, Australia has now run out of tricks. Bainimarama now has the leadership, has hardened his resolve against Australia and is extending his diplomatic reach, including joining the 118-nation non-aligned movement. Meanwhile, Australia continues with its failed strategy of isolating Fiji and has left a power vacuum which other countries are rushing to fill. In particular, this is China. China now funds the Melanesia Spearhead Group Secretariat in the Vanuatu capital of Port Vila and has hosted Prime Minister Bainimarama for an extensive visit to Beijing. The Fijian Prime Minister did not take much convincing as to where his best interests lay, saying China is the only nation that can help assist Fiji in its reforms because of the way the Chinese think. They are visionary. We need infrastructure, water, electricity. Australia and New Zealand and America, none of those nations are going to provide that. It is a sentiment shared by the Chinese, with China's Vice Foreign Minister Su Tin-kei saying in a visit last year to the Pacific region, his country's ambition was to, quote, to further strengthen cooperation with Pacific Islands regional organisations. Mr Deputy Speaker, the language is subtle, but the message is not. An expansionary China eyes a strategic opportunity to expand its influence in our region and is now in headlong pursuit. Fiji is not the only beneficiary. In addition to a generous aid program late last year, East Timor purchased 2 Shanghai-class patrol boats, and its Prime Minister, Xanana Gusmao, indicated his desire for stronger bilateral military ties. Australia's cause for concern only compounded by the revelation in the WikiLeaks cables that in 2010 Beijing approached Dili about establishing a surveillance radar facility on its coast under the guise of helping Dili campaign against illegal fishing. With China offering to build and operate the facility with Chinese technicians for no cost, the Timorese fortunately understood the offer for what it was, namely an attempt to expand China's intelligence collection capability in the region. But despite this near miss, there is nothing to say the next Chinese offer will face a similar rebuke. Elsewhere in Vanuatu, the parliamentary building has received funding from Beijing, so too the High Court building in the Cook Islands, a school building in Tonga, and the sports stadiums in Port Moresby and Suva, to name a few examples of China's largesse. Soft loans running into the hundreds of millions of dollars, strategic investments from Chinese state enterprises have been matched by high-level visits, including from the Chinese Premier, and goodwill visits from the Chinese Navy to ports throughout the Pacific. While the success and reach of China's efforts are abundantly clear, the United States has renewed their efforts, with Hillary Clinton visiting PNG late last year, holding special meetings with Pacific Island leaders on the margins of the UN General Assembly, and America's Assistant Secretary for East Asian and Pacific Affairs, Kurt Campbell, reiterating before Congress the Obama administration's interests in the South Pacific, calling for an enhanced engagement with the region, a step up of their commitment. What a contrast, Mr Deputy Speaker, to Australia. Our Foreign Minister, Kevin Rudd, has found time to visit Liechtenstein, Tunisia and Kazakhstan, but has not made one visit to PNG, Fiji or New Zealand since his appointment as Foreign Minister. PNG and Fiji have not been graced by his presence since 2008. Such a travel itinerary for an Australian Foreign Minister is incompetent at best and negligent at worst. If Australia has a Prime Minister who, by her own admission, has no interest in foreign policy matters and would rather be in a school classroom than meeting her contemporary foreign leaders, and a Foreign Minister who is intent on pursuing his own personal ambitions in the United Nations than on visiting our neighbours in the region, what hope do we have of correcting this mess that we find ourselves in the South Pacific? What is more, with the Prime Minister and Foreign Minister barely on speaking terms, the likelihood of a coordinated and effective new strategy is nil. All this from a government whose foreign policy achievements are minimal, but whose foreign policy failures are numerous. An Asia-Pacific community initiative that failed to get off the ground. A non-existent East Timor solution that antagonised our key neighbours, including Indonesia. And an abandoned quadrilateral security dialogue with strategic partners India, Japan and the United States are all initiatives to name just a few that have failed. Mr Deputy Speaker, I finish off where I started. Australia's strategic influence in the South Pacific is on the wane, and the Gillard government's foreign policy approach is compounding our problems. Urgent action is required, and our Foreign Minister cannot afford to be distracted by personal frolics abroad or personal vendettas at home. Australia's national interest requires dramatic action today, because tomorrow will be too late.